Hello, and welcome to Free History. I'm your host, Will Hickox, and I'm speaking to you from the Watkins Museum of History in Lawrence, Kansas. In response to growing interest in the histories of issues like civil rights, race, and democracy that are filling the headlines now, several cultural institutions in Kansas have partnered to present a series of video interviews with historians and other experts touching on connections between historical events and human rights. Free History is a collaboration between the Hall Center for the Humanities, Humanities Kansas, the Watkins Museum of History, Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and the University of Kansas Department of African and African American Studies. I encourage you to check out our Facebook page to see our schedule of upcoming videos. And our guest today is Dr. Ian Michael Spurgeon. Ian is a Kansas native. He earned a PhD in history from the University of Southern Mississippi. He now works at the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, where he does military history for the office searching for the remains of missing soldiers. So hello, Ian, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to talk a little bit about Kansas history.
Absolutely. So Ian authored this great book, Soldiers in the Army of Freedom, the first Kansas Colored, the Civil War's first African-American combat unit, which I'm currently reading for the second time. It's an outstanding work, and it fills an important area of Civil War studies and contributes greatly to our knowledge of both the experiences of African-American troops in the war and what the war was like in Kansas and Missouri, areas that until recently were not very well studied and known about. Ian is also author of Man of Douglas, Man of Lincoln, The Political Odyssey of James Henry Lane. All right, so we have a lot of fascinating ground to cover in this discussion, so I'd like to jump right in with some questions, if that works for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, please ask.
Right. So Ian, could you give us a little more of your background and how you came to write the history of the first Kansas Colored Infantry?
Okay, well, as you mentioned, I'm a Kansas native, originally from Wichita. And I fell in love with Civil War history as a high school student in the early 1990s. And I bring this up because, like a lot of, Civil War enthusiasts and history buffs and historians, I turned my attention to the East. You know, if you look at most magazines, books, movies, topics about the Civil War, they're talking about Gettysburg, they're talking about Bull Run, Antietam. You know, if they're talking about the West, they're talking about like Atlanta, you know, and that's where so much of the attention, that seems to be for a lot of people where the importance is. And so as a young high school student just getting into Civil War history, I really didn't appreciate much of Kansas's history. It didn't seem as important because there wasn't as much about it written or focused, the size of the battles, etc. And so even when I went and got my history degrees, my bachelor's, my master's at Kansas State University, studying Civil War history, I looked east. And my master's thesis was actually about newspapers from Georgia and Virginia, Confederate newspapers during the war. And so I'm kind of sad to say that I didn't really even appreciate Kansas history much from that era until I left Kansas in 1999. And after I finished my master's, worked for a bit, and then began my PhD at University of Southern Mississippi. And in that time, living away from Kansas, I began to grow a little bit more appreciative of home, of what was going on back there, specifically with my Civil War research. And as I started my PhD in particular, we started looking for resources and topics that were both fascinating and where we could actually find material to be using. And I knew about the first Kansas Colored Infantry. There are articles, there are stories, there are resources out there. There was no book about the unit, which really surprised me as I was trying to find more about it. And I actually considered writing about the first Kansas Colored Infantry as my PhD dissertation. But I chose not to for what I thought was, I hope, a good reason, as I didn't want it to be an academic thesis-driven book. There was so much about the story that I think was narrative, that was drawn to a lot of different topics, that I didn't want to make it an assignment, a project like that. I love academic history, I have that background, and I knew that for a dissertation, I really needed to hit something a lot more specific, more thesis-driven. And what I ended up doing was taking a related subject, and that was James Henry Lane. And I focused on his political views. I had access, because of family in Kansas, I'd go back to Kansas and go to the archives. And that topic, he's a fascinating figure. I hope the viewers know about him. He was a US Senator from Kansas, a leading free state anti-slavery figure, but he was also a very controversial figure. People loved him or they hated him. And he turned out also to be the single most important person for the creation of the first Kansas Colored Infantry. So my PhD dissertation allowed me to really study him, the politics, the military situation in Kansas, and really the development of the Civil War. I focused on his political career from 1854, when Kansas was being established as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, up until he actually committed suicide in 1866. So that area really bracketed the fight over slavery and the Civil War. But I knew I wanted to do the first Kansas Colored Infantry, so as soon as I finished that dissertation and the book about Blaine, I turned immediately to the first Kansas Colored, saying, this is a fascinating story. I'm going to try to use my background with this and write a book that would be more interesting and accessible to the public, to tell the story with that historical academic background, but yet the public history as well. So that's what I try to accomplish, and I hope that it's useful for a wide audience.
Could you elaborate for our viewers what made the soldiers of the 1st Kansas special in terms of their motives for enlisting and fighting in the Civil War, which I think you make an argument that for that case, that they were a unique outfit in the war?
Yeah, they are. And actually, related to that question is also the issue of kind of why Kansas. And so maybe I'll kind of put those together, because when we talk about the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, I mean, it is not a very well-known unit. I'm hoping it's becoming, more well-known. And it's largely overshadowed by the 54th Massachusetts and the movie Glory. I like to point that out because I'm not criticizing Glory. I love that movie, and it really helped me become, an inspiring Civil War historian. But it does a disservice, and by really putting the story of Black soldiers into that Massachusetts, and New England, and the eastern side. And the movie does a very good job of kind of showing both the free Black as well as the former slaves. But what happened with the 54th Massachusetts and compared to the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, in many ways, are very different experiences. Your question was, what did these soldiers face? And I'll say, I'll answer briefly in the sense that it's hard to tell by available records, but I would estimate that 95% or more of the members of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry were former slaves. There were some free Blacks, and even the free Blacks who joined may have, and most likely, most of them had been slaves at some point. But we are talking about recently freed slaves who are fighting a very different kind of war and experience than a lot of the recruits from Massachusetts, who many were well-educated, free their whole lives. In Kansas, you're talking about men who were, in many cases, right out of slavery and going back into places like Missouri and Arkansas, where they had come from, and they're fighting against former masters. And so that's quite a different experience for them. And that did happen with other Black regiments across the Union, of course. But the 1st Kansas Colored tackled that very early on as the first Black regiment raised in the northern state and the first to see combat. I can really go into talking about why Kansas. I mentioned that, and I think that was one of the questions you and I had talked about before. I actually think that's one of the most important questions about the 1st Kansas Colored. When I began doing this work, it was the question I was asking myself. In fact, even before I did that work was, why Kansas? I grew up in Kansas. It's not really well known for a lot of civil rights efforts. In fact, Brown versus Board of Education is one notable Kansas tied to civil rights, and it was on the side of segregation. So how does something like the 1st Black regiment from a northern state and the 1st Black regiment see combat, how does this come out of Kansas? And in my book, I spend the first 2, maybe 3 chapters really talking about this. So it's a little hard sometimes to summarize, but I really think that's kind of the importance and helps a lot of people, particularly Kansans, understand how Kansas was important and what was different about it for that experience. And the way I try to explain this, and I'll do this as quickly as possible, is I really broke it down into 4 factors that were really the requirements for the creation of a Black regiment early in the war, relatively early in the war, and how the 1st Kansas Colored came to be. And those are necessity, geography, population, and leadership. And this is not a test. I'll go ahead and explain those a little bit more. But those kind of intermingle and come together to really make Kansas the perfect place for a Black regiment. And the first was necessity. Any student of Civil War history knows that when the Civil War broke out in 1861, there was a great excitement, great fervor for volunteers. thousands of volunteers, white volunteers, flooded to recruitment offices. They had more volunteers than they could put into service, and most people expected the war to be over in 3 months or so, or just a few months, with minimal change to society. There were, in parts of the North, free Black volunteers, men going to the recruiting stations and volunteering, but they were rejected. They were rejected for several reasons. Again, most people thought the war would be too short. There were more than enough white volunteers, and something that we really need to emphasize, that white supremacist attitudes were very prevalent across the North. Even though we talk about the Civil War as the free states versus slave states, and slavery was integral to secession and why ultimately secession and the Civil War happened, the North was not all abolitionists. Abolitionists, in fact, the ones that truly believed in racial equality, were a very small portion of the American population, Northern population. And so for many white Northerners, accepting Black men as soldiers in 1861 and much of 1862 was too radical. They saw military service as a path to equality. Everybody did. In the United States, if you served in the US military, that was a civic duty. That was the ability to earn your respect as a citizen. If you allow Black soldiers into combat, they have a right for citizenship. That was too radical in 1861 for most Northerners. But that was 1861. The war didn't end, as we know, in 3 months. It didn't end in just 1 year. Federal forces were losing their battles, a lot of the battles, I should say, not all of them, but particularly notable battles in the East. And along with that, casualties were mounting. Armies needed new recruits to replace the fallen soldiers, and they had to continue recruiting to build new regiments because the war was expanding. So by 1862, there was really a lot less excitement about military service. So much so that federal authorities began offering bounties or payment to get volunteers in, and eventually instituted a draft. Now, we all know that, but what I'd like to point out is that necessity for troops was not equal across all of the North. There were some areas that were more desperate for men than others. And that leads to the second part, which was geography. Now, when you talk about the Civil War, as I just mentioned, we often think of the East. We often think of the Eastern Theater, Virginia, you're talking about even Maryland, Pennsylvania. That's where most of the attention is drawn. And again, even when you're talking about the West, you're talking about Tennessee and Georgia. But if you look at the fringes of the war effort. Now, I will also stop here and say, Kansas, the first Kansas Colored was the first Black regiment raised in the Northern Unit. It was not the first Black regiment raised for Union forces. I have to stipulate that. The first effort was in Union-occupied areas of South Carolina and the Sea Islands. And then also in the fall, the first Black regiment to be mustered into service was Union troops in Louisiana under Ben Butler. These share the same situation with Kansas in some areas. They're on the fringes. They're on the outside where they're isolated and away from the major campaigns. They're distant from Washington, D.C. They're distant from the main War Department effort to send supplies, men, troops, money, attention. So these areas are having to, even Kansas, which is the farthest west of the contiguous part of the northern states, is isolated. It's relatively isolated. It's far away. It's having to rely a lot on its own resources. The second part of that geography is its neighbors. Kansas, and as well the Union forces in South Carolina and Louisiana, they're isolated and they're right next to either Confederate or pro-secessionist populations. I'll just focus on Kansas here, of course, in the sense that we look at Kansas's borders. Missouri to the east. And Missouri, of course, was a Unionist state, but had a very large slaveholding pro-secessionist population, particularly near the Kansas border. There was a large irregular force of Confederate guerrillas operating right next to Kansas and eventually going into Kansas. And the battles going back to 1855, 56 of Kansas versus Missourians had long been established. People knew that this was going to be a battle site. And so you have that geography, and below you have Indian Territory, modern day Oklahoma, which was also in many places pro-Confederate. So Kansas is not just isolated from Washington, D.C., it also has basically a battle theater campaign right on two of its borders. And in 1862, as the war is getting into its second year, it only had 12 regiments. It had 12 regiments to defend its borders and support offensive campaigns. Now we compare that to, for instance, Massachusetts. Massachusetts had 60 regiments from its state going into the Civil War by mid-1862. And that was a state that wasn't guarding its border. So Kansas geographically is isolated, far away. And then again, it's starting to need more troops, which is where it gets to population. Now, the white male population of Kansas in 1860 was around 57,000 or so. So I just mentioned 12 regiments in 1862, which of its male population was about 20% of Kansas's white male population was already in federal service by 1862. In comparison, I have these notes as well, Massachusetts' white male population was 10 times as much, 592,000. So Kansas has such a small white male population, it's isolated, it's far away from Washington, D.C., it's having a strain on manpower. Where is it going to find men to guard the Kansas border? The people in Kansas begin looking for new troops, and they have to come up with new ideas. Now, one was Native Americans. There were Native Americans in Kansas and also Native American in the Indian Territory, and there were a couple of regiments raised from that. But what about African Americans? And this is where, how does this become a black regiment? Now, this is where most people think Kansas doesn't seem obvious. In 1860, the official black population of Kansas was, I think, about 620 or so, 625. And that included men, women, and children. But as the war progressed, fugitive slaves and runaway blacks, including some free blacks, began fleeing into Kansas, and to where the population, black population in Kansas grew to 6,000 by 1863. And so now you have these military-aged males, these healthy black men, coming into Kansas while the white population is already being strained. And so now you start having the foundation for it. And this is where the last little part comes into play, and that's leadership. You can have all those things in play. You can have the need for troops, you can have the geographic isolation, and you can have available black men. But some people still, that was too radical to push. In Kansas, though, this is where it's, again, perfect. You have the history of battling over slavery in Kansas since 1855. You have a large abolitionist and a large anti-slavery white population in there. And so these men have already been fighting, either in the Civil War, even before. They're active in anti-slavery efforts. They're sympathetic to black civil rights. And then you have people like, the most important person is James Henry Lane. And this is where it comes into him, a guy who's a US Senator. He has some recruiting authority. He was not a true abolitionist, but he hated secession. And he was willing to kind of bend the rules and stretch his authority. And he sees all these needs. He wants to take war into Missouri. He wants to take war into the South. He said, well, why not? Why not use these able-bodied black men and actually turn these former slaves against their former masters and win the war? And so his isolation from Washington, D.C., I have to point out, when he started pushing this forward in summer of 1862, he starts getting men that he knows, his guys, to start recruiting. The Lincoln administration, Edwin Stanton, the War Department, actually sent him a telegram saying, you have not been authorized to do this. You know, basically stop. This goes beyond the rules and the policies allowed by the administration. Well, Lane doesn't care. He ignores it. And he realizes Kansas is out in the frontier. No one's going to come out and stop him. He's got enough political clout and support that essentially he uses his leadership to say, I'm going to put black soldiers into combat. And the people in Kansas, for the most part, even if they don't like that idea, they realize there's a need for it, and it goes forward. And those factors really came together to put hundreds and hundreds, eventually over 1,000, mostly former slaves, into uniform and into combat. So that is kind of the rundown of how these factors came and why Kansas was actually the perfect environment for a black regiment in the mid-Civil War, and one of the first raised in the northern state, the first to see combat.
So you described how this regiment came about, and we have some questions from people who want to dig into, like, who were these men? Where did they come from? We have a question from our Facebook community. Someone asked, what were the primary states represented? I assume they mean among the personnel in the regiment. And did they receive equal pay benefits such as food and lodging?
Okay, so those are two very important questions. I'll start with the first. What states were represented? That is actually a really fascinating part of this story, because most Civil War regiments, white regiments, were locally raised. So you would have an Indiana regiment. Most of those guys came from the same community, same area of Indiana. They knew each other. With black regiments, that was sometimes the case. With the Kansas regiment, though, 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, there was no pre-existing black population in Kansas that had grown up there where these guys knew each other. Every single one of the men who served in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was from somewhere else when they joined the regiment, when they went to the enlistment offices in Kansas, or later the regiment actually continued its recruiting when it was down in Indian Territory and Arkansas. So there were some men who served in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry who may never have actually gone into Kansas because they joined the regiment when it was in Arkansas, and then the war ended, and may never have actually gone into Kansas itself. The records about these men, the enlistment records, are incomplete and imperfect. So we don't know every single story of every single soldier. But as far as I could tell, based on the records that I reviewed, there were at least 15 states represented by the men in the unit, that they would list their nativity, where they were born. Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. At least 10 soldiers I found had actually listed their at least previous residence as a northern state. So some, actually, there were a very small number that were possibly born as free men, but certainly lived in northern states beforehand. There was even one that was from Canada, who actually listed himself as Black Hawk Indian. So there were a few Native Americans. There were also several that may have been half Native American. They came from Indian Territory. Early on, most of the recruitment was in Kansas from 1862. The regiment began recruitment in August of 1862, and was in Kansas up until early mid-1863, when it went down into Indian Territory. Almost half of the recruits at that point listed Missouri as their place of residence or nativity. Some may have been born elsewhere, but most of those soldiers were fugitive slaves or escapees from Missouri. When the regiment moved into Indian Territory, it recruited locally. When it moved into Arkansas, it was in northwest Arkansas for several months, particularly in 1864. They were replenishing the ranks from recruits from Arkansas there. Mm-hmm. So again, this was a regiment that represented several different parts of the country at that time. The next question you said was pay. Is that correct?
Yes. Did they receive equal pay benefits such as food and lodging?
So this, like all Black regiments during the Civil War, was a very touchy subject. When the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was first recruited in 1862, the recruiting officers, I think probably meaning well, and this was pushed by Lane, told the men, if you join us, you'll get equal pay, you will get equal treatment, you'll get equal equipment. They were not able to do that, partly because I don't think they were lying to the men, but there was a difference between putting forward what was essentially an unofficial or illegal Black regiment with local officials who could push it so far, but they couldn't get funding, they couldn't get all the money they needed for the troops, for pay, and the soldiers received no pay until at least summer of 1863. So there were some men who served from August, September, October, until muster, until federal muster. Even then, there were complications, there were problems getting pay, and I think, as most people who have studied Civil War history know, Black soldiers were also paid less than white soldiers, at least initially. I think there was some justification that was part of some militia act that dictated how much money. Normal white soldiers, I think, got paid around $13. The Black soldiers were given $10, and then some of that was deducted for uniforms and equipment. So even when these soldiers began getting paid, this was true for the 1st Kansas Colored as well, they received less pay, and that was always a touchy subject. The white officers continuously wrote letters and argued, saying, we were promised our men would get paid. That was somewhat rectified in 1864. In fact, James Lane himself kept kind of progressing in his racial views. He was not an abolitionist early in the war, but by 1864, he was advocating that Black soldiers, all Black soldiers, should be paid equally, because by treating them differently, they were doing a disservice to their own men in the uniform. And eventually, I think around mid-1864, so the War Department changed the pay to equal that for the white soldiers. At the end of the war in 1865, radical Republicans, who by this time were really engaged in trying to push civil rights, even pushed forward legislation that would offer retroactive pay to Black Union soldiers who may not have been paid equally through that time, and that was approved. And officers from the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry argued not only should their men be paid until they were formally mustered, which was January 1863, they argued, pay our men who have been in the ranks since the fall of 1862. That actually was rejected. That was where the legacy of James Lane pushing through things unofficially kind of came back to hurt it, because the War Department eventually came back and said, essentially, we'll pay them to 1863, but before that, you actually weren't approved by the War Department, therefore the War Department's not going to authorize that pay. There were still some efforts after the war by former officers to kind of push for that, but ultimately that pay issue continued to be a sore spot for that regiment, and many of these soldiers served for months with either no pay or very unequal pay until the end of the war.
Mm. So you've definitely indicated how they faced special difficulties in service, both from being African Americans in service and from the special circumstances of being enlisted in Kansas. That's very interesting. I realize that I did not, I should have asked a question about how they actually got into combat, because they did see combat fairly early in their service. And maybe I can connect this with a question here. So if you could describe for us, how did they eventually enter active duty and see combat? And how did Confederates, the enemy, react when they faced these black soldiers in combat?
Absolutely. And that it's a pretty easy segue with what I talked about earlier about necessity.
Yeah.
So one of the things you talked about was the treatment, the special circumstances and the treatment. Pay was only one problem that these black soldiers faced. Another one was the prejudice against them by even other Union authorities and other white Union units. There was a real resistance, especially in 1862 and then going into 1863, by a lot of white units that did not like the idea of serving next to black soldiers. They had this idea that this somehow demeaned their service. And there was a lot of prejudice. Fights were breaking out. They had to separate the black unit from a lot of the white units around Fort Scott or Fort Lincoln. And typically, the best way that the 1st Kansas Colored would respond to that was essentially do a parade or a drill in front of the white troops, and they were very well trained. The white officers and the men themselves, for the most part, really focused on making sure they were very well prepared. And some of the witnesses said that usually shut the white soldiers up when they saw how good these guys were acting. But one of the biggest fears they had, the white officers as well as the black soldiers themselves, was that they would be only used for manual labor. Some of the early arguments for black military service was not that they would be combat troops, but that they would be used to dig ditches, build fortifications, do a lot of the menial labor that white soldiers didn't want to do. James Lane himself actually used that as a justification early on, saying, we have all these former slaves, hey, yeah, let's put them in the army, have them dig the latrines, have them dig the ditches, build the fortifications, and let the white soldiers fight. That changed overall, because again, as the war dragged on, the romance of war, people like wanting to go and fight and die, changed. A lot of white soldiers eventually said, you know what, if black soldiers want to go off and fight and die instead of me, that's better. But the big thing in Kansas was, again, there was the need. There were officers around Fort Scott, white officers in other units, that were starting to try to push the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry into a laboring role. But there was just too much of a need for troops. And in October of 1862, Confederate guerrillas operating in Missouri, reports of that got to Fort Scott, and literally the 1st Kansas Colored was given the assignment because they did not have enough white troops there. So this again is why the regiment was raised in the first place, was because they couldn't be just dedicated to manual labor. There was such a need for combat troops that they were sent into Missouri in October 1862 specifically to respond to reports of Confederate guerrilla activity. And that's where they ran into them, at the Toothman Farm, which became the first time a organized black Union unit of the Civil War saw combat. And they won in that battle as well. So after that, they continued to show their military prowess, but there continued to be a need for troops. And they were integrated, at least into Union armies overall in that portion, from campaigns through Indian Territory into Arkansas, and no one ever really questioned after that the fact that they could fight and that they were needed to fight.
Did the Confederates react? Did the Confederates facing the 1st Kansas fight them more fiercely than they did white Union soldiers, or was there just a different sensibility among the Confederates when they faced the 1st Kansas?
There are multiple reports from the battles. I mean, this is at least the written reports from the white officers, et cetera, who were there, that they would hear taunts, they would hear comments that once a lot of the Confederate soldiers saw that they were faced off against black soldiers, that the tension increased, that there was a visible and audible change. Lots of derogatory comments yelled their way, and there's no doubt that the black soldiers coming into combat against Confederate soldiers changed the tension, changed the dynamic on the battlefield. I mean, already when you think about Civil War armies fighting each other, In many ways, people today have a hard time. I had a kind of struggle with a hard time is, Union versus Confederate, kind of abstract, the idea of the Union, the idea of, state sovereignty or state rights, and what does it mean, a democracy, etc. And there was already a war going on that. When this unit, black soldiers, moves into there, this is a totally different thing. Now we're talking about actual racial and social changes, the challenges, the kinds of things that the political battle over slavery we're trying to kind of handle both politically and then militarily. Now you have something which really struck fear in the hearts of most Southerners and had for decades, which was slave insurrection. Mm-hmm. There was this fear, as long as slavery had existed in the colonies and then in America, of slaves rebelling and slaves revolting. That was actually one of the arguments against in the South against Lincoln and the Republicans. They're going to cause slave upheavals. It's going to tear apart Southern society. When black soldiers are seen carrying guns with blue uniforms on, a lot of Confederates saw this as the reality of this is literally a formalized slave insurrection. And there was a lot of bitterness and anger. And so there are these reports of Confederates at Island Mound, at Honey Springs, and later Poison Spring, by the Union soldiers of hearing these, very, very angry, almost hate-filled comments by these Confederates are attacking. Union forces, the 1st Kansas Colored, won those battles early on, which also kind of increase some of the tension. And then what we have, which is the greatest tragedy for the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, was the fighting at Poison Spring. And for those who are not familiar with that, that was actually one of the notable racial atrocities of the Civil War. The 1st Kansas Colored won most of its major pitched battles. There were a couple times in which at Sherwood, Missouri in 1863 and Flat Rock, Indian Territory, in which detachments of the soldiers were attacked and essentially wiped out, murdered by Confederate guerrillas or Confederate forces. But typically when the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry went into battle as its organized force, it won, except at Poison Spring, when it was outnumbered almost 10 to 1. After fighting for about 2 hours on the battlefield, trying to protect a Union supply train, they were eventually just completely overwhelmed by superior numbers. And Union and Confederate forces do confirm after the battle that there were accounts of Confederate soldiers executing black soldiers afterwards. And most of the black troops knew that to either surrender or to be wounded and fall into Confederate hands could lead to either execution or enslavement. And that appears to have happened multiple times. The enslavement, it's a little bit harder to tell if that happened. There were a few black soldiers that actually were somehow protected and taken into prison camps, very few. Probably count on one hand. Most of them, if they did not escape, especially at Poison Spring, most of them were executed. So that became a particularly contentious part. And I'll add as well, at Poison Spring, a lot of the Confederate units that fought against the 1st Kansas Colored had fought them at Honey Springs and had been beaten before. So not only do you have the racial element, but there's also this kind of revenge aspect from being beaten before. That was obviously a different type of war than white soldiers typically faced. White soldiers, unless they were fighting guerrilla warfare, traditional armies, they could be expected to be treated as prisoners. The 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, when they went into battle, they knew that there was no guarantee that if they were captured or wounded, that they would survive. And that did occur throughout the war.
Well, it just brings home how courageous these men were to serve in these circumstances. Not only did they face difficulty in being formed into a regiment, and then problems with supply and with prejudice on their own side, but they face special, enhanced dangers in the field as well. So sticking with the topic of field service for a moment, we have another question from our Facebook community. I have heard that the 1st Kansas saw action in the Battle of Westport and that they were led by an African-American officer, William Minor, and that it was the first time in U.S. military history that black troops were commanded by a black officer in battle. I am wondering if this is true.
Okay, they were not at Westport. So their Westport, being by Kansas City, around that time, the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was down in Indian Territory in Arkansas. So they were a couple hundred miles away to the south, doing combat operations down there. There were, and I'm not an expert in the Battle of Westport, there were black Kansas troops at Westport. In fact, I think the person, they said William Minor, I think they mean William Matthews. William Matthews had been an officer with the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry during its first few months. There were at least a couple, Patrick Minor and William Matthews. That might be the combination of those two names. Those men had been very well respected officers before the unit was mustered in. What ended up happening was actually both of those men, I believe, were at Island Mound. So they were at Island Mound as officers. Their details, their participation is not very well recorded. The battle itself, there's not a whole lot of primary sources that talk about it, but they were likely there and should have been with the unit throughout its service. But when the regiment was formally mustered into federal service, and to kind of clarify, so they were kind of an unofficial state organization from August of 1862 until January 13th, 1863, at which point the federal government formally accepted them into federal service. It was after the Emancipation Proclamation and when recruiting, and the 54th Massachusetts recruited in March of 1863. So all this is even happening before the 54th Massachusetts. When it was going into federal service, which meant it fell under the War Department, federal officials refused to muster Matthews and Minor in as officers. They said the War Department will only allow black enlisted soldiers to serve. And there was a battle back and forth. All of the white officers supported Matthews and Minor. Said these guys have been, from the beginning, they're well respected, they're educated, the men love them. These need to be officers. But the War Department initially said no, and the mustering officials refused. So Matthews and Minor left the unit at that time. It was actually a pretty sore subject. There is a report in the National Archives where the War Department eventually did authorize William Matthews to be mustered in as an officer, but that apparently never reached the regiment, or not in time, because he was now gone from the regiment and ended up serving in a different unit later in the war. So again, actually, and there was a 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry, as well as, like I said, like an African-American battery. So the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was not the only black Kansas regiment. It was the first to see combat, but Kansas continued to raise black units, and actually, I believe, again, they fought at Westport, but the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry by that time was in operations in Arkansas.
Interesting. All right, well, I don't want to give up this conversation. It's been so fascinating. We do have one more, actually, it's another two-parter.
Sure.
One more set of questions dealing with what happened post-war. What happened to these black veterans post-war, and were their lives different from those of other Civil War veterans?
Okay, yeah, I could talk about this all day, so I'll try to kind of keep it short here. Post-war, these soldiers, you can track a lot of the movement of soldiers, not necessarily by the census, but by the pension records. I ended up using the pension records at the National Archives pretty heavily. I couldn't pull all of them. I did a pretty big sampling, I think about 200 to 250 of them. And that kind of tells a little bit of the post-war life. As best as I can tell, the men, particularly from Missouri, who had run away from slavery, did not go back to Missouri. Most of them, if they ran away to Kansas, whether to join the regiment or just ran into Kansas and then joined the regiment, a lot of them stayed in Kansas or moved on somewhere else. It seemed to be the trend that the men who ran away far away from slavery did not go back. I found a surprising number of the men, though, from Indian Territory, Oklahoma, and Arkansas went back. We went back to those communities. And that, I think, probably reflects that some of those men joined the unit when it was in their area and recruiting nearby. So they joined from their community. They had family members still there. May have still had, friends and relatives and had something to go back to. So after the war, those men spread everywhere from across Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, but ended up in California. Some ended up in Colorado. There's one at least in Minnesota. And most of these men simply just wanted to have normal, free lives. I really try to emphasize that with the book. Authors tend to, historians and authors tend to take their subject and say, it's the most important thing ever. This was the most important black regiment ever. I try not to say that. I try to really represent saying this is a special regiment for many ways, but we really have to understand that these guys really just wanted what we would consider very basic and simple things. They wanted freedom, they wanted rights, they wanted the ability to work for themselves, have their own families, and live peaceful lives. And so when the war was done, these men weren't, anything radical. They were simply trying to live their lives as much as possible. And a lot of them settled in white communities, had good jobs afterwards, worked hard, and had large families, and did essentially what they were really asking for, which was freedom and their rights. They also did recognize, though, and there were reunions after, that they had influenced federal law and federal policy. And the officers afterwards really gave them a lot of credit, went to Washington, D.C. and said, these guys really helped, First Kansas Colored in particular, Island Mound. It was represented in Harper's Weekly in 1863. I mean, their big question was, will black soldiers fight? First Kansas Colored Infantry was one of the first to prove, yeah, they will, and well. And they earned the respect of a lot of Kansans. A lot of real prejudiced white Kansas at the beginning of the war came out saying, these guys, we want them fighting next to us. So after the war, it had to have helped break some of the boundaries. But ultimately, these guys spread out and lived their lives as best as they could. And that's exactly what they wanted.
Excellent. Well, Ian, this has been just an illuminating discussion about a topic of the Civil War that was, I think you'll agree, was ignored for too long, and that your book has, and your research has helped to illuminate and bring to a larger audience. And I just want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Of course, thank you.
I recommend everyone pick up Ian's book, Soldiers in the Army of Freedom. It's a great read about a fascinating topic.